Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the Swire Lounge and to a discussion about public art in the city, which is, of course, is a massive subject, but I think in just under an hour we can do it justice to a certain extent. The panel before you is very distinguished and actually covers many areas of, I think, what will become clear is quite a broad territory. So Michael Lin is an artist who lives and works in Taipei, and who's going to actually take us deeper into one of his own works. The notion of painting as environment, I know, is one of the central things to his practice. It reminded me, actually, as I was reading around Michael, Ad Reinhardt's great statement, which was said in humour, that sculpture was something that we tripped over when we stepped back to get a better look at painting. I think that has certain resonance in how art can and should operate in the public domain. It shouldn't trip us up, but maybe metaphorically it should hijack us. Andrew Mead is the chief architect of the MTR here in Hong Kong, and actually, rather modestly, plays down his involvement in the arts, but I think probably is the most extensive curator in this part of Southeast Asia. If you look at the works that he is responsible for or has been involved in the implementation of, and Matthias Rastorfer is a distinguished gallerist, so distinguished that he's actually on the selection committee for all three of the Basel Art Fairs, not least this one. So if there are any disgruntled gallerists here in the audience, just nothing to do with me, but here he is. The gallery, Gummerzinska, is his gallery, and it's based in St. Moritz and Zurich. And he was previously, he's worked at a number of galleries, but Pace in New York. So he has the geographical spread as well as the cultural spread. Julius Popp was down to talk, but sadly he's back in Germany. He has a family situation to deal with. His father's not very well, but his work up at Pacific Place is there, and I've just been to see it, and I'm sure many of you are aware of it, but go and see that. In some ways, seeing the work can be better than even hearing the artist speak, although, as Michael will prove as he kicks us off, that he's a man who can do both. No, that's no pressure, Michael. So there are many things that we're going to try and deal with in a direct and roundabout way. Not least, what is public art? We all know roughly what we mean by that. There's certain artists, Anthony Gormley in Britain certainly is the most celebrated, who says, I hate the category, it doesn't exist, which is ironic given he's a major proponent of it. So we want to talk about what actually public art is. How do we facilitate it? What's its purpose? How do we measure its success and failure? But we're going to start, not as a case study, but with Michael taking us through a particular project he did, and then the discussion will begin from that. So Michael, over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Actually, I have another anecdote about the Ad Reinhardt story about backing up to looking at painting, tripping over sculpture. I mean, there's this. Is this sound all right? Sounds yeah. Okay. There's this great story about how Peggy Guggenheim commissioned Jackson Pollock for a painting for her apartment, and of course Jackson Pollock painted the painting on a canvas, and they came over to install the work. And Duchamp was there to help put it up. And supposedly the canvas was just a little too long, so he said, it's all right, go ahead, just cut a part off it. So they put it on the wall, and it became one of the most photographed paintings for the longest time, with people standing in front of it. So you have all these photographs of Jackson Pollock and Peggy Guggenheim in front of this big painting. So I always thought, in some ways, that with my work, that most of the people like to stand with their backs to it. That I made paintings for people to stand with their backs to it and make photographs of themselves in front of it. So in that way, we can talk about a kind of immersive painting, I guess, where people implicate themselves in your work and it becomes a background or the space. So this is a work that was commissioned for the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design in Manila. It's in the neighborhood of Malate. It's in the center of the city, the old center. And it was my first time in Manila, and the director invited me, obviously, because she had a 50-meter wall that she thought would look great if I could just make it into a large painting for people to stand in front of. So when I got there, the first things I noticed was I mean, whenever I'm invited, I like to go and really try to understand the spaces because there are always commissions, so I'm always asked to visit. And in the last several years, I've been quite an avid cyclist, and in Shanghai, I was just riding to work. I mean, a cyclist meaning not a road racer, but just riding my bicycle to work and using it as a mode of transportation. So when I arrived in Manila, in the city center, what caught my eye immediately were the pedicabs that are still very much part of the transportation of Manila. And immediately I thought, wow, this is great. This is something that I want to try to understand how this is still functioning and how I can somehow have an exchange or bring them into the exhibition. So the next slide. There we go. So the idea was to make an exchange with them. And so the research started, and I realized that the pedicabs function within their own neighborhoods. So the city is broken down in the Philippines into barangays. Barangays are small neighborhoods. They're smaller than, usually sometimes they're just a street or two, not even a whole block. And so they are a kind of a unit in the division in the districts of the city, and they have representatives, and then the pedicabs are then distributed in that way because they're not allowed to cross the borders into the other barangays. So what I did was we tried to work with the barangays that bordered the museum. And so it was initiating an exchange at first. I said, okay, I will give you, or I will exchange new tarps for your tarps. You know, so it was just very straightforward. Because I really saw, I mean, when I first saw them, I saw them as these kind of moving canvases, because what they are, they're just a steel frame with this kind of fabric over them, stretched, just like a painting. And another aspect of the museum that was very interesting that caught my eye was there was a big garage door in the back of the museum, usually used for the loading bay, which made it as the perfect connection to the street outside. So that you see this ramp that comes down. Usually, of course, they build a wall in front of it just to hang paintings. It's never shown as part of the exhibition. So I exposed that, and go to the next slide. So I ended up working with 3 of the barangays that bordered the museum, and with each of the tarps that I received from them, I cut them up and I made them into checkered flags. So this first one is barangay 976, for example, and the next one and the next one. So what I did was we exchanged a total of 15, so 5 for each barangay. And I set up these flags in the middle of the museum, and then we arranged for them to come in periodically, twice a day, according to their schedule, to come and race through the museum, because it happened to be a very long corridor. So periodically, you would be in the exhibition, and unannounced, the big garage door would slowly open, and then you would see a few pedicabs come racing in down the line to do a few turns. Well, no, you were able to hail them. You were able to hail them and take them straight back out. So
I do feel that one of the exercise activities that most people get is walking around a gallery, and here you are encouraging people's indolence by they can take a cab around the gallery. We should try it at the Royal Academy. It'd be wonderful.
Usually I ask them to lay down too and relax. So this was kind of I mean, it wasn't really considered a performance because there was no scheduling. It was really by chance if you happened to be there and, you know, they happened to roll in, because it was something very quick. It took them less than 10 minutes to do the round and then go right back out. But I think one of the other aspects of that work, which, you know, is very important, is that they go right back out into the city and into the neighborhoods around the museum. So even approaching the museum, you might catch one by chance. So, and another part of that is that they're still there. And so it's been a year now, and I think what's going on now is that they've become almost because usually these pedicabs are covered. They're very personalized. They either have their family name on it. They have the name of their children, or the barangay they're from. You saw they had also Mickey Mouse on them, or So now, what I gave them, they're starting to also personalize. So it starts to have its own life, and it continues this life. And I don't know. I mean, I presented this project thinking that I think maybe a lot of the things that we're going to talk about are a lot of questions about what we're going to talk about are raised in this work itself, in terms of, what is the public, and where does the public start, and where does the public end, and also this idea of public art being just a temporal kind of happening, or like these pedicabs, they kind of pass, or these ideas of maybe participation. What is the relationship between the work and the people that live there, and how could they participate in that? And that's what I thought. Maybe this could be a good way to start the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a sense, it blurs the boundary between inside the museum and not. It certainly blurs the boundary between the artwork as object and artwork as performance. And just one final question before we go through the three of us is, I would imagine that you could say that the work was successful because people knowingly and unknowingly became involved in the work in an active way by taking the pedicab. How was it broadly received? I mean, hand on heart, everyone always says public art projects when they're involved, it's tremendously successful, and we'll look at how to measure that. But did you feel it reached people in ways that you were hoping to do broadly? I mean, did it take off as a kind of populist thing, or was it still quite a subtle thing? A year later, people would have seen those things, and many people wouldn't have had a clue what they were, and maybe that doesn't matter, I don't know.
I think a lot of people were quite touched by it. I think a lot of people were touched by it because it was something in their daily life that somehow was brought into the museum. I'm talking about the general audience.
Yeah.
That it reflected their environment and a community from where they're from. I think that always is important for people to kind of have a connection with and feel a certain amount of pride, I think.
I mean, there's another aspect that I think interesting about your project is the timing, the aging of a work of art. And if it's a public work of art, very often they start being installed with ribbon cutting, and they look beautiful at the beginning. And very often over time, they either age terribly or nobody cares about them anymore, and they end up in a corner where they collect dust and nobody sees them. So with your project, I would be interested in understanding how that ages, because obviously it takes a life on its own when you leave those cabbies outside, but also how long is that project alive?
Well, like I said, it's been a year, and I think these tarps, they last quite a long time, and
that's what I'm saying. It's intended to be indefinite.
Yes, because it was an exchange. It was a gift. It's theirs. They own it, so they can use as they are. There was no, I didn't sign them. I didn't, there wasn't a time limit where we would take them back, and so I think that it's something that continues.
One of the most extraordinary projects I saw recently was. William Kentridge did a piece called Triumphs and Laments in Rome, where he took images from the history of Rome over the decades, centuries, and he made these kind of stencils, and then basically using high-powered hosing, 2,000, 3,000 years worth of grime and pollution and rubbish was blown away, leaving the silhouettes in black of these forms, which he then used it's on the Tiber. He used it as a backdrop. It's about 300 metres. It was a kind of processive aspect for 3 nights of performance, of operatic performance. And now the work is still there as a frieze, but will be reclaimed by the pollution in the city sometime over the next 5 to 10 years. So it deals with the issues you said, actually, as well, that and that you're dealing with, Michael. Now, Andrew, it's partly public money, or private money, and it's also because you have other issues of practicalities and health and safety. But the works you produced have tended to use the subway system as a gallery without walls. You have to have something at least permanent over a few decades, don't you? Or is even that not? Is even that up in the air?
All the works that I've commissioned typically are designed to last 30 years, which is the design life for the architectural finishes of the stations. Yes, we do work with a very tight set of restrictions, and whenever I commission an artist, the first thing I say to them, okay, you can use any material you like as long as it's glass, steel or stone. Go ahead, have fun. Because the fire safety and the material safety is absolutely critical to the metro. But it's amazing within those confines, the range of responses that have come out with the artists I've worked with throughout my career, both here in Hong Kong, Singapore, and prior to that in Toronto. I often say it's an art gallery. It's not. It's a transit system. And I expect my artworks to work very hard as part of that transit system. And so I usually like to have a dialogue with the artists. We usually commission them at the time we're planning the station. We talk them through the station planning, we talk them through the area, and then we have a dialogue with them to try to bring out something unique. And that dialogue includes partly the audience. We're not like an art fair or an art gallery where people choose to go and look at art and to engage with art. They may be going to school. They may be going to work. They may choose never to step into an art gallery in their lives. Yet I could have people like you guys wander into the MTR, hopefully you will after this talk, and see works that you go, wow, that's incredible. And so working in that sphere is quite specific. I've got a few examples which I'll throw up if I can, rather than just talk about it. Can I get my slides up? Okay, we jumped one ahead. Okay, so this is one of our recent works at Sai Ying Pun Station. For those of you in Hong Kong, it's the West Island Line extension. Louise Soloway-Chan, she's actually here somewhere. I spotted her earlier. I've been doing art in transit now for 25 years, and this work just blows me away. It's a series of bas-relief panels. Louise is a painter by initial training, then she learned how to do this bas-relief. And it's a series of panels that is just capturing daily life. And I was saying to someone the other day, sometimes it takes an outsider, Louise is British like myself, to really appreciate the quality and the details of local life. And she really has captured through here. You go down to the artwork and you often see this. Maybe it's going back to your people with their back to the walk. But this is, to me, is also one of the measures of success. How do you measure successful works? And people are stopping to actually notice them. And this is, I got to tell you, this work is actually located at the bottom of a lift shaft. It's not in the main part of the station. You really kind of hunt your way down and find it, and then you get people interacting with the work.
So one of the measures of success for you is the number of people who are gathering round a work to look at it or photograph it, thereby blocking the transit flow of people. But actually, that's a good paradox.
Yeah, part of that discussion is where the artwork goes. This is a lift shaft. So you've got a few minutes here to do it, but I wouldn't do a work like this down a busy corridor. Yeah. Then we commission something quite different. This is another new example, and I just use this one just to show the examples. This is the original design for Ho Man Tin Station. Again, another new station here in Hong Kong. And you can see the wall finishes are all basically the same. When we was working with the artists, this is what we did. So the artwork you can see is on the column through here, but also the removal of some of the colours. And then this final slide shows what it is as built. And the important thing is the painting part of this. It actually forms a big arrow, and it's actually pointing people to where the escalator is. So there's a lot of subliminal, subtle messages that are often built into the works that may not be directly in your face, but they're worked through working with the artist, working with a dialogue, and actually complementing the space in which we're doing. And again, it's deliberately not a very detailed work, because if I had people standing here, they'll be blocking the escalator. So again, that kind of thing. Final example just shows you the dialogue. This is Flow by Benson Kwan. It's, again, another new station at Ocean Park. And this was the original submission by the artist to create this freestanding sculpture, which was about flow and fish. It's beside our Ocean Park theme park here. Now, I'm not an art curator, so whether that's good art or not, don't ask me. But I know from a transit designer, all those sharp edges, all those fish would be great to climb on. And I don't want to have that in the middle of my station. So what we did with that piece is we actually elevated it up into the ceiling. And the fish now flow in the same way in which the passengers flow in the station. So again, it's working with the space that it's been created for and complementing it. And similarly upstairs, I haven't got a picture for that, but it shows the fish going down over the escalators. And it enables you to be eye level with the fish. So there's my little plug. Take a ride out on the MTR and go and see this artwork down at Ocean Park.
Just briefly, do you have a panel of, you have a committee of people, architects, artists, or art advisors and engineers who are selecting work, so that you've got taste, context, as well as practicality and so on.
Yeah.
There's a group of you.
There's a big group of me. I mean, I used to be a civil servant in Singapore, and I'm used to dealing with all these committees. So ultimately, MTR has an executive committee level group that specifically looks at the art from a corporate point of view. But equally, we recognise that none of us within MTR are experts. So we actually have an independent art advisory panel that helps us select the artists and also then helps us with the development process. So we have lots of working sessions with the artists. Then we take it to the art advisory panel. Is this still on track? Is it still correct? Is it still appropriate? And then through a whole series of processes, including obviously safety reviews, we make sure that the final work can be installed reasonable costs, safe, and it is appropriate for the stations that we're working in.
Matthias, I'm not picking on you just because you happen to be on the selection committee here, but I think the notion of how things are selected, I mean, in a fair, in a public domain for public collections, I mean, is an interesting one, isn't it? There's always a feeling that the art world, expanding as it is a sort of tightly knit conspiracy of would-be avant-gardists trying to promote or promulgate a kind of taste on the world. Although if you look at the taste that's reflected in an art fair like this or in the kind of projects that you've curated or selected, it's vast. But do you want to talk a little bit about selection and popularity?
Well, when I came to New York, a young, aspiring, not yet art dealer, the first advice that I got by a senior art gallerist was, look at a lot of art and choose your enemies. And I think it's been a lifelong, very good advice. I mean, there's one thing you cannot define, which is taste. Yet, however, I think we would all agree that if you look at something great, you know that it's great. So I think the problem is more the middle and the lower section. So greatness, I think, over time will always be recognized, and I think this is something for a more classically orientated gallery like us, something where we obviously have research, we have various ways of finding out if an artist or his career has been something that left an impact. And I think, listening to you both and with my own experience, I think the one point that I always take is how long-lasting is the impact and how current will it remain. And I think that was something that interested me with your project in particular, because when you do anything that involves public, over time taste changes. Things acquire what we call a patina. Either it becomes better or it becomes worse. And seeing it in context is also something that I think is very important because it shows quality as well. So if we curate a show, let's say with classic modern masters, parallel to younger artists, and you mix it and you don't focus on the labels, people will define quality by themselves. And I think that's something that an art fair actually does. It's like a medieval marketplace, and it gives you the possibility to compare oranges, both in terms of price and quality, and you buy the oranges that you think are the best for the best price. So that's the art fair feeling. But I think when it comes to the public domain, it's a very different concept. And I think the question that you asked is what works well as public art and what works badly as public art sort of kept me thinking. And I mean, there are so many aspects that lead to the selection of public art. Does it have finance from the city, from a government? And is it kept alive? Is it something that actually is precious enough? And I remember very well discussions with famous museum founders like Peter Ludwig, for example, who founded many, many museums in Germany. He said to me once that, when you give a collection, when you donate something, you have to make sure that they not only receive the gift, but that it also costs them something. And I think that Joseph Beuys, I did the first retrospective after his death. He was very involved with public art and the perception of the audience. He said to me that if you actually sell something to a person, it has to hurt a little. So if you're a working class person that buys a piece for $100, that means something to you and it hurts a little bit. If you're a multimillionaire, you have to spend a few more, that it hurts. So he always designed pieces that were meant for different audiences to hurt a little bit. And I think the same goes for public art. It has to be something that is not just a byproduct, but it's something that means something to you, that costs you something, and that also has an impact that you want to preserve. If you want, we can show you some of those. Okay, so we are currently showing Christo. Christo is obviously a very well-known public figure. He also happens to give a lecture at the Hong Kong University tonight, which we organized at 6:30 precisely. And so he came here to Hong Kong for the first time since 1990, and he's never been to an art fair. He hates art fairs, and he doesn't want to be at an art fair even close to it because he thinks artists should never be at an art fair. We convinced him, however, with our extraordinary skills, to do it by saying, well, Asia knows you in Japan, but it doesn't know you as well in the rest of Asia. And, you've just done one of the most extraordinary public art spaces. So this was shown last summer, Lago di Seo, Italy, tiny little place. These were kilometers of floating piers that were designed to about have 300,000 visitors. He had 1.6 million. So it was a nightmare in terms of logistics, but it was extraordinary as an experience. And here you have public art, which he finances completely privately. He does these drawings and these designs to have his independence, to have no sponsor, to have no person that actually has something to say about it. He finances it even with banks. And then once the project's done, it probably was, like many of his projects, 10, 15, 30 years in the making. It lasts for 15 days. So here you have temporary, and we always come back to the element of timing. Here you have something that only is done for 15 days, takes years to make, 1,000 people to assemble, another half year to deassemble, but it's this one moment where you experience it. And this one doesn't age, because after 15 days, by the way, you really wanted to disassemble it, because after 1.6 million visitors, it didn't look so hot anymore. This is his next project, which he's been working on for 35 years, and it's meant to be bigger than the St. Paul's Cathedral. It's going to be a pyramid built out of oil barrels, which are stacked up to create an ancient, very classic pyramid type of housing, which is going to be outside of Abu Dhabi. He's gone through several sheikhs, he's gone through several other obstacles, and he's 82 and he still wants to see that happen. This would be, by the way, the only permanent structure that he would do. This is something that we did, and that raises another question: how authentic and how much involvement of the artist do you need to do a public art project? So obviously, ideally, the artist designs it, it's displayed, he sanctions it. It's a little bit like casting a work of art. Is it done during the lifetime or after? This was a project that Yves Klein had in mind for a casino in Las Vegas, which was designed to be a huge alley with his famous Yves Klein Venuses displayed in public. So we did that as a recreation, exactly to his perception and how he wanted it done, at a public space in Zurich. It was beautiful to look at. It caused, of course, a lot of discussions. Is this an Yves Klein or is that not an Yves Klein? But it was actually not for sale, so we just did that as something to show the intentions of the artist. Now, this is a very important mural sculpture. There are only 3 editions that he did of that. One is at the Parliament in Milano, and the other one was something that we were able to show. Now, we showed that on Paradeplatz in Zurich, right in front of Credit Suisse. It causes another nightmare, which is city logistics. To build this, or to allow that sculpture to be displayed, took about 15 different departments from Zurich: police, tramway, fire brigade, tourist office, Credit Suisse representatives. It was a nightmare to do it. Once we did it, they wanted it very close to the building because they didn't want it close to the tramway, so I'm sure you relate to these questions. Of course, a nightmare to insure, because no insurance company would allow you to have a piece of that value out without fence. So if it would have been according to the insurance, it should have had a fence. If it was according to the fire brigade, it should have been not there at all. And so these kinds of discussions get you involved all the time. Now, this was another example where we had a major piece by David Smith. Unfortunately, the timing was very bad because it was during the football World Championship in Switzerland and Germany, and some people mistook it as a goal post. And we're actually playing with it, and it took us a guard 24 hours afterwards to protect this piece.
A referee, I should think.
Almost a referee. So this is just an example of how many various possibilities of public art you have and how to protect them.
It's a really interesting selection, and of course, every one of those is, I'd say, kind of world class in its in different ways. But I suppose the interesting thing is opportunity. That you have the knowledge and influence to be able to work in those public domains, or you work with an artist like Christo. Very interestingly, he raises all the money, so he has no accountability. But he's still involved in negotiating the place in which he does it. The big question for both of you two in different ways. I mean, Michael, an artwork can only be as good as the opportunity that the artist is given, although sometimes a restricted opportunity is something you can kick against or blur or play with, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, unfortunately, all of us can't raise our own funding for the projects. But I think that one question that comes up, and it comes up all the time when I'm involved in public commissioning, is when you sign the contract and we talk about the responsibility of the artist, of how when you produce a work, 10 years down the line, if some paint cracks, how long are you responsible for the work? And I think that's something that needs. I think I've read different versions of it. Actually, my wife, who's also an artist, has a public project in the city of Bruges in Belgium. And I was quite surprised when she told me that on her contract that she signed for this project, that the city ensures the maintenance of the work 50 years after the death of the artist. So I was really surprised to hear that. And I heard there was a number like 30 years. And so it's a number that I'm always, looking out for in these contracts is, well, what is, how long can we be responsible, and what this idea of permanence, what does that mean? 30 years, 10 years, 50 years after the artist's death?
I like Andrew's definition, because I would say that the works that in the MT are permanent, or at least semi-permanent. And I mean they're there, but you're saying it's 30 years, and so that seems reasonable because it's also the architectural fabric of the place. Now, we've had a case in London recently where it was completely misreported. It was a work by Eduardo Palozzi. Part of it was moved at Tottenham Court Road Station. Some people in the art world are still outraged because they're ill-informed. The work wasn't destroyed, and its contract wasn't to be there for life, but they've preserved it. They've moved it. But it is interesting if the contracts. I suppose it works both ways, Michael, doesn't it? That if an artist produces something, should the city actually be responsible for it in perpetuity, or should the artwork naturally have a life of its own, as the Kentridge does, and so on? I wonder what you feel about that, Andrew.
Well, the 30 rear, the 50 year, we designed the rest of the station to last for 30 years, so that's where the number comes from.
But do you reserve the right, when you revamp the station, that the artwork can go? Because that was the issue in London. It must be preserved at all costs, and the building had to go around.
Contractually, yes. And we always reserve that right because sometimes you get developments happen, new developments, new entrances, you might have to move the work. But the spirit of what we're doing is we are creating a permanent work for the station. And I've been involved not here in Hong Kong, but in Singapore, where we had a work at Orchard Station, like the flagship station there. There was a development that happened over the top. The contractor, despite clear instructions that he needed to carefully dismantle the work, didn't, threw it in a skip. So fortunately the artist was still alive, a lot older. His son was also involved. And so what we did at the contractor's expense was recommission a new piece. We had it reinstalled in a new station because we actually had a better space by then. And now it is up there at Marina Bay Station for all to see. So I think that's a lot to do with the client. And I say, in my world, which is very specific in the transit world, durability is essential. And the key about maintaining those things. Most of the artworks I do are part and parcel of the architectural fabric of the stations. And so I spend a lot of time with my maintenance team, my operations team, both explaining the works to them, but also explaining them how to maintain them, which is typically how you maintain the rest of the station. I try to avoid using materials or techniques that need special maintaining. Because as I move on from projects, as the other people that are involved in the creation of projects, that care and concern passes away. But one of the interesting things about creating a long-term permanent work is a lot of the works we do, we talked about earlier about taste and fashion, are sometimes time capsules. They are of the particular moment. And there's a wonderful piece that I didn't commission in Singapore, which was done as part of the opening one, which is incredibly nationalistic. It's got a big Singapore flag. It's actually got missiles being fired off and somebody with blood on their forehead. But if you take yourself back to Singapore...
Sounds like a wonderful piece.
Sounds like North Korea, actually, I thought. But
you should go check it out. It's at one of the central stations, Raffles Place. And it's a wonderful, wonderful piece. And we renovated that station. And I took the opportunity there to move that painting to somewhere else in the station, put some proper lighting on it, and actually put it in a place where it could really be appreciated. And so I think that's the commitment that I think not just Hong Kong MTR, but Singapore, anywhere that does art in transit, London, New York as well. These pieces are treasured. And I think the Roland Polezzi piece is a very good example of that, where it was commissioned a long time ago. It has been looked after. It's become part of the fabric. But, of course, the city evolves, and we need to be able to make sure that we can be flexible both with the art and the architecture.
There's another topic that I think has not been raised yet, and which is authenticity. I mean, we've recently had many discussions about artists revoking their promise or their authorship on certain works. So what happens if, I mean, Peter Doig is an example, and Joseph Kossuth very often...
but Peter didn't revoke, did he?
No, he actually said it wasn't mine. Yeah. But there are other... I mean, there's Joseph Kossuth, who very often says, well, if it's not installed exactly the way I want it, then it's not my piece. And even if you bought it, if you paid for it, if it's done in any other way, then it's no longer my piece. So that, I think, raises another question of public art, that if it's moved from one place to the other, if it's shown in a different kind of context, is it still that work that the artist created?
I mean, just quickly though, because I think it has to do with also, I mean, is the artist consulted? Or is he even alive to be consulted? I think would be, even a...
Well, with the example I quoted from Singapore, yes, the artist was still alive, but he was quite old, so it was actually project managed by his son. And so we did that. By and large, we tried to keep them in the place where we conceive them. And that is one of the considerations when we're locating the artwork. Again, in my world, I'm always competing with our advertising friends, because the best place for art is also happens to be the best place for advertising. And we have to figure out a way to get the two coexisting together. But generally what I say to the advertising team is there's lots of services. The artwork takes up a tiny percentage of the total fabric of the station. There's plenty of other places that we can advertise on, and we can do that. So up till now, I've not had any artists revoke any of the pieces on me. Frankly, I've not had to move many around. But we'll see in the decades to come.
I mean, I think one question is also if the work was conceived as a movable piece of work, is it portable? And I mean, it seems like a lot that are commissioned, especially I guess in the MRT or MTR, shouldn't be movable or for a specific wall. They're actually part of the architecture. So when it's removed from that context, I mean, how far do you go? Can it be just framed and then put into a house over a couch, or
Sure.
I think then it becomes an historical document, or there's fragments of a work rather than the work itself. But it's interesting, the Yves Klein piece that Matthias showed us, because I don't know whether Klein's estate disputes whether or not it shouldn't be shown anywhere other than Vegas, but it looked fantastic to me, and that looked like a work that benefited from, it was enriched by moving from one context to another, and there was something self-contained about the material part of the work that meant that could happen.
Well, actually, it was upon the request of the Yves Klein estate that we did it, because very often, I'm sure you can relate, if you have a project that is of a large scale and you would have liked to have it happen and it didn't, very often artists, even Christo, as a perfect example, for 30 years, 35 years, he's working on something that he had an idea that he wanted in a specific location, and the Reichstag only became available when it was redone by Norman Foster, so he had to wait 25 years, several parliaments, and so on. But in the case of something where you're involved in a state, you are one layer removed, obviously, and it was the widow in this particular case that had all the drawings and all the designs, and she wanted it to actually happen, and as an homage to Yves Klein. So I think the homage element sometimes justifies that, but you have to clearly explain that it is a homage and that it is not a work by the artist.
We've got about just under 15 minutes left, and before I throw you to the floor, let's deal briefly with the big question, the elephant in the room, maybe, which is Matthias has said you can't really determine taste, but the notion of public taste, popularity, not necessarily how we gauge that, but whether art. You working in your studio, Michael, I would imagine with most artists that the responsibility has to be to yourself. You can't be responsible to your audience. Artists don't have audiences per se; they inherit them, or they often. But if you're working on a commission for a particular place, then there is a sense of an audience there. So, how much responsibility does public art have, in a way that other kinds of art doesn't have, to engage with a broad audience? And should we be caring? I don't say should we be inflicting art on people who don't want to encounter it, but should we care about what people who have no interest in art actually think about it?
Good one.
Well, I have to go back to, unfortunately, not all of us can finance our own projects in the public domain. So I think that responsibility towards an audience is shared between the I would say usually the public that supports that project as the client and the artist. What was the other part of the question?
Well, what it wasn't was me posturing as if I'm part of a liberal elite that has no connection with the rest of the world, which is why the world is, excuse my language, as fucked up as it is in parts of the West. There is that disconnect. But there is a broader question
okay,
there about whether you... Andrew could also help answer this, which is there is obviously in the public domain, there needs to be a certain amount of work that the public will relate to more easily. But my view, broadly, for what it's worth, is actually if you put good quality art in the public domain, as well as crap art in the public domain, the public tend to respond better to the good art. If you put a girl on with a sort of dolphin, riding a dolphin in the middle of a harbour, not that I'm thinking of anyone in particular, people will photograph it a bit, but if you put something really extraordinary on a plinth in the middle of Trafalgar Square for 90 days, actually many more people engage with it. The myth is that, because people take selfies in front of the girl on the dolphin, that somehow it's a successful public work of art. So I suppose it's to do with quality as well as responsibility and the balancing of taste.
Well, I'm sorry, I'll give you another chance here to answer that. I think it really depends on the artist and his practice. I don't work in my studio. All my work is actually produced on site, and all my work is commissioned, or not all, but a large percentage of it is. So that means I'm always working with a site in mind and also an audience in mind, and that includes all kinds of baggage, all cultural differences, all climate, everything, I think. So it really depends. Of course, there are a lot of work in the public domain that is made in the studio and then put out there, like the portable work we're talking about. But in my line of practice, it's through commission, and it's with a place in mind?
Well, actually, I can quote Beuys again, and I thought it was a fantastic quote. He gave a lecture in 1972 at the Cooper Hewitt in New York when he had the great retrospective at the Guggenheim. And Beuys was always someone who taught anti-establishment and not being part of the mainstream. So there was a student that got up and asked Beuys, Mr. Beuys, how can you teach anti-establishment and here you're showing at the Guggenheim? And he said, you know, art's like a bloody knife. Use it, but clean it. And I thought this is the perfect example. Don't be in the ivory tower. Don't distance yourself and say, well, they're all terrible people and I have nothing to do with that. I'm the elitist. Actually, do the two things. Do your work, but also understand who it is for and make them understand it.
And I think, you know, a metro environment is as far from the ivory tower as you possibly can get. And certainly to try to answer your specific question, in the works I've commissioned throughout my career, it's a conscious decision for diversity. So expose the audience to a different ranges, voices, etc., etc. But by using that art advisory panel, always ensure their quality works. So that cuts out the crap. We've always got. But as much as I'm always thrilled when people go around and say, I love that work, I also get quite excited when I find out people talking about work and they said, I really don't like that one, I really don't get that one. To me, the works that are the huge failures, the ones that they don't even notice. The ones that you do notice, that you react either positive or negatively to, they're the good works. It's the ones that are bland that are worst.
So it's an active response, even if it's a negative one. I think that's interesting, right? And that's about public engagement in a way. Look, let's throw to the floor, because we're under 10 minutes, and I can see all sorts of distinguished people from all sorts of different backgrounds who may want to ask questions. Yeah.
I have an MTR question. Maybe it's one country, two metro systems. So MTR operates some lines in Beijing where I live, as well as here, obviously. But the model is completely different. In Beijing, the subway stations are sterile. If there's art, it's up for a day and just some special thing, and then it's gone. Why is that? Is it the government? Is it the city? And is it likely to change? Thanks.
Okay, that's a nice, difficult question. Simple answer is I'm not involved in those projects. If they were, you would have them. I'm relatively new to MTR. I've only been here 4 years. Most of my career, as I probably may have figured out, was in Singapore. And I'm really building upon the art program that I've inherited here. The program started here in 1998. Seeing the value in art really takes an enlightened management and also a city. And you don't always have that in all of the cities. Sometimes it takes a little bit of maturity. Maybe that is something that, as we expand our business overseas, is what sets MTR apart, is that we see that as part of the customer experience, commissioning great art that resonates with the people, resonates specifically, that artwork that can only exist in that one station. You can't just take it from one station to another. That can only exist in your hometown, that you resonate as a resident. That's where we could go. So plenty of room for further art, I think, is the answer.
Thank you. Thank you all. Great talk. As former curatorial director of Event Horizon with Anthony Gormley, I got to see something which I think is really important that was touched on the topic yesterday, which is the soul of the city. And what is art's role in exposing that? And I think with Event Horizon, what it exposed was an architectural soul of the city, but also by projecting that project into the public realm without explanation, without plinths, and getting all the necessary people involved, it exposed the soul of the city for those that were involved, the 15 government departments, Swire and many others, to enable that to happen without public money and to allow people to have a strength of feeling about the project. I think that's probably the biggest measure of success, is the strength of that feeling rather than visitor numbers. And is that a way of exposing the soul of a city through public art in the public realm?
That's great. So in the 4 minutes we've got left, you've got to, in a non-Cartesian manner, talk about the notion of duality and the soul of the city. What is the soul of the city? But it's a great question, actually, about the role of art, not just in the soul of the city, but looking at the architectural soul, you said. What other souls, or you maybe use a different phrase, are you looking to expose or play with, Andrew?
I was dreading that question coming to me. To me, I've designed metros all my life, and I've lived in many different cities. And to me, the heart and soul of any city, a particular city like Hong Kong, is its metro system, is Hong Kong. You can't think of Hong Kong. Hong Kong couldn't exist without MTR. So when you touch MTR, and I mean that just from simply an architectural experience or a rider point of view, you are touching the soul of Hong Kong. And the artworks we're doing is reflecting that soul. And so what we try to do is, we're working with local artists, is showcasing that soul back to Hong Kong and back to the world, because most tourists will travel on the MTR. And you get this expectation that with MTR, the 99.9%, the trains are always running on time, etc. But what you don't expect to encounter is world-class artworks. And that really shows off the depth of soul here. So I think that the cultural vibrancy is here. We're actively growing it, and I'm glad that MTR is a key part of that.
It's really interesting. William Blake had a notion of particularly the underground rivers in London, but the sewage system as well, as being part of. I don't think he used this phrase, but he talked about the underground labyrinth. But I always thought it was about the nervous system. And Francis Bacon, the most viscerally disturbing of perhaps of all 20th century painters, always talked about wanting his art to operate on the nervous system. And maybe in the notion of flow, that's what art on a subway station does. It's about the kind of nervous system of a city. Thank you, Cassie. That's great. One more question, final question, or I've got a wrap at one. It's the one they're all dreading, by the way. I did say unfairly, and I thought we didn't need to do it because we don't have to name and shame. I asked each of the panellists when we had a discussion a few days ago to think of the best work they've encountered and the worst work they've encountered in the public domain. They don't even have to say why, so that's fairer because we haven't got any time. But I'm going to ask each of them. You can avoid the question. The audience will see what you're doing. Or you can be cryptic. You can certainly undermine the credibility of your moderator for asking such a crass question, but I'm still going to try. Michael, best and worst. Personal, totally personal.
I'm only going to say the best.
Right.
Okay, the best. I have it down right here. So the winner is the Copacabana Beach Promenade by Roberto Burro Marx.
Fantastic. And he won't have a go on the worst. Fair enough. I suppose as an artist we may let him off the hook. Andrew.
The best, Inside Outside by Louise Soloway Chan. Go to Sai Ying Pun. It blew me away when I saw it. And I wasn't actually originally commissioning for that piece, but I helped Louise see the best piece. I'm going to be crass and dodge the worst one.
We'll do that. Matthias.
Well, the worst are countless, unfortunately. So it would be too long, I thought.
And that's dodging it.
Exactly. I would say that one of the pieces that always got me was Louise Nevelson in New York, Chase Manhattan Plaza, which was a work that she did relatively late in her life, but was an extraordinary thing for the city of New York to give an entire square to one artist to make an extraordinarily large-scale sculpture, and that for a Russian immigrant at age 70-something. So that would be one of my favorites.
Right. Well, the worst sculpture in the world, without a doubt. But I don't want to kind of over-privilege it by mentioning the artist's name. Well, I'll tell you quietly afterwards. Nothing against this artist. I barely know it happens to be him. But it's the schmaltziest piece of romanticised crap on a gigantic scale, with no merit whatsoever apart from a kind of technical facility to transfer the idea from one material into another. It shows two people embracing. It doesn't play in any sophisticated way on the notion of the kiss by Rodin or Brancusi. It's in St Pancras Station. The ultimate conceptual gesture would be to melt it down and make something interesting out of it, or at least put it on wheels and wheel it round the country. But as it happens, we're stuck with it. It was not approved by any particular body or board. It was just plonked there.
You really like it,
yeah?
huh?
Oh, yeah. Off record, I think it was the friend of the CEO of whatever. The worst kind of commissioning. Anyway, I don't feel particularly strongly about it, so I'll just shut up. The best work, obviously, would be something like William Kentridge at the moment for me. But I think the thing I've learned, I think we've all learned from this, is, well, two things. One is, pick your enemies. Brilliant. I've just done that. And secondly, I think the notion of this kind of fluidity and flexibility, the public art is a broad sphere. We need a broad ecology of different things, but ultimately, we need to give artists and commissioners and engineers and architects the opportunity of doing interesting things, and if we do, then they'll respond well. So can I thank Michael, Andrew, Matthias very much, and thank you all for coming.